we have to innovate technology to make it more economic. It's not just going to be a policy imperative that gets there. So addressing those three nodes of industry players, capital markets, and stakeholders broadly is what ultimately gets us to the next phase of decarbonization, which is really the hard to abate stuff.
Hello, I'm Sean McLean, partner in charge here in Heidrick Struggles Calgary office and a member of the Global Industrial and Financial Officers practices. In today's podcast, I'm joined by Avik Dey, the president and CEO of Capital Power, an independent power generation company based in Alberta, Canada. Avik leads the company in its growth and expansion plans across Canada and the US and champions the team in accelerating its current strategic drive to net zero. Avik is a seasoned global executive and transformational leader with over 2 decades in the energy business in roles spanning operations, entrepreneurial ventures, investment banking, and corporate advisory services. He's invested over $12 billion in growing long-term value for energy and energy transition companies. Before joining Capital Power, Avik was managing director, partner, and co-head of Carlyle International Energy Partners. He was also the CFO and chief transformation officer for Nova Chemicals, a leading global polyethylene producer. Previously, Avik served as managing director and head of energy and resources at the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, or CPPIB, and was a member of the global leadership team, chair of the Energy and Resources Investment Committee, and Real Assets Investment and Management Committees. Under his leadership, the Energy and Resource Group grew from an idea to a leading global investor focused on energy transition. Avik strongly believes in fostering the next generation of entrepreneurs and currently serves as the director of Enactus Canada, an international nonprofit helping university students solve the world's biggest problems through social innovation. He has previously served on the boards of Calpine Corporation, Seven Generations Energy, Tyne Energy, Wolf Midstream, and Crestone Peak Resources. Avik, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Sean. Excited to be here with you.
You've had this fascinating international career. You could have continued to work anywhere in the world, but we managed to attract you back to Alberta. Tell us a little about your journey to becoming CEO of Capital Power and what excited you most about taking on the role.
Thanks, Sean. My journey has been a fascinating one. And for me, one of the most important parts of it is I've been able to surround myself with exceptional people, amazing mentors and leaders, and more importantly, people who owned my outcome, if not as much as I did, which allowed me to have these incredible experiences across different industries and take on different roles, which is really what has brought me home. For me, the most exciting part about coming home is the agency associated with being where you grew up. You know, the ability to come and lead an organization in a business community where I grew up looking up to some of the most exceptional leaders of our generation in a community that was a world leader in the energy sector is a huge honor. But beyond that, for me, this has always resonated about Alberta and Western Canada for many parts, is there's always been this spirit of entrepreneurism that's reigned here, in particular in Alberta, that dates back more than a century. In addition to that, for me, I've spent the better part of the last decade focused pretty heavily on industrial decarbonization. And the energy industry here in Alberta has been at the forefront of innovation, leaning in on policy, establishing a framework for decarbonization and energy transition. And I think we've established ourselves as a leader in the space globally. And so for the opportunity to come home and be part of a company who's at the forefront of that change is, for me, once in a lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, as you know, we've followed your story with interest for many years. It was pretty exciting myself as a third generation Albertan to play a role in bringing you back to Alberta and such a great company like Capital Power. Specific to the energy industry, you've obviously seen it from multiple viewpoints: board, executive, operational, investing, and senior advisory roles. What are we doing well, and what must we do better in Canada?
I think in Canada, we've always had this spirit of innovation and entrepreneurism. I think that's what's made our country special on a world stage, and that dates back decades. And so when you look at some of our most impressive contributions to society or the world at large, whether it's the Canada Arm, athleisure wear, or building some of the greatest energy companies on the planet, it's always been on a foundation of innovation and expertise. And part of that's been created by the strategic moat that we have around our country that allows for these companies to groom and prosper and grow. But part of it is just the fabric of who we are. We all grew up in a very cold place with harsh climate. So there's a resilience factor that we all grow up with. And I think that's enabled a lot of success in Canada. And I think that's part of why we've thrived historically.
Avik, I'm glad you mentioned some of the Canadian success stories there. You and I recently spoke, though, of the emergency break glass situation that we have with Canadian productivity levels continuing to lag. How do we reverse this trend, and what role do Canadian CEOs play?
Well, what's been interesting as globalization has proliferated, in particular over the last 30 years, is we live in a more competitive world than we ever have, and a more connected world than we ever have. So the impetus upon us is to build companies in this country that are competitive here and abroad. And if we do that, we create greater wealth, we create more profit, we create more jobs, and we recycle more capital back into our country's coffers that contribute to GDP growth. So the break glass element of where we are as a country now is over the last 30 years, we've had a massive reduction in productivity. And that's been a result fairly directly from the different interventions that we've had in terms of policy, in terms of taxation, in terms of just even interprovincial relations inside the country that prohibit growth or prohibit trade between our provinces. And where we are as a country is the only ones that lose when we're not successful is us. The only ones that gain if we are successful are us and everyone else. And so how we facilitate companies to do great things and allow for companies to grow and compete globally is really systematically allowing for the free exchange of ideas and capital and competition. And I think that has been a foundation of democracies over the last 2 or 3 generations. That's been under fire over the last, call it, decade as populism has run rampant. But fundamentally, if we're competing in a world of free trade and exchange of products and goods and services, we have to encourage our companies to do great things. And the role that CEOs have in that is we have to be willing to vocalize and articulate what it is that we need, not just why things are not right or why things aren't working. So whether it's advocacy for specific trade policies, advocacy for specific policies regarding taxation, advocacy for policies encouraging different industry growth mandates, we have to be willing to take positions and advocate for them, not just sit on the fence.
That's well said. And I've seen you already doing that in your first year in this mandate. Thank you. That's important and helpful work to hear CEOs taking a stand or expressing a point of view on these matters. The energy industry has been and will continue to be in an extended period of change and disruption as we drive towards net zero. In this noisy environment, how do you and your team prioritize where to focus, what to learn, which expertise to bring onto the team?
Well, first and foremost, energy transition is not a threat. It's an opportunity. The opportunity to address climate change and lead from the front in finding viable economic solutions to addressing climate change, whether it's on the industrial decarbonization side or all the way downstream to consumer products, is a multi-generational opportunity for us to lead. And we've been there and done that before on the industry side. So for me, in terms of how we set our own priorities, look, it's been a learning journey for us as well. Our company in particular, in the early 2010s, we prioritized reliability and affordability of electricity as we marched into our own journey on decarbonization or climate action. But the message that we conveyed was you cannot compromise reliability and affordability for straight clean electricity. You have to do both. And I think as we've collectively progressed on that journey of decarbonization, I think society at large around the world has established that, in fact, you have to have reliability, affordability, and decarbonization to be able to ultimately lead us towards a net zero future. So for me, in terms of what we've learned through that last decade, is that you really have to prioritize what you're good at and how you can contribute to the organization. I think we've done some incredible work from a stakeholder engagement. When you think about the climate conversation, there's historically always been three stakeholder groups effectively. There's been government policymakers, there's been industry, and then there's been capital markets who fund that growth. And that triangle, at any point in time, one of those nodes has been in front of the other. And if I look back to what's happened in renewables, we've seen an incredible growth in renewables, less than 1% in 2010 to 14% of the grid here in the US in particular over that period of time. But why did renewables proliferate? Not because it was cleaner, but because it was better and more efficient. And that allowed for significant renewable penetration. So as we sit here today and try and determine the best pathway to reducing emissions across the industrial complex, which is more than half of global emissions, we have to strive to find the economic pathways that get us there. We have to innovate technology to make it more economic. It's not just going to be a policy imperative that gets there. So addressing those three nodes of industry players, capital markets, and stakeholders broadly is what ultimately gets us to the next phase of decarbonization, which is really the hard to abate stuff.
Totally. You and I have talked a bit about the talent market globally, and I've shared that we're continuing to see a war for talent that is really more a barometer of just the pace of change and some demographic shifts than it really is overall economic conditions. Do you have any advice for other Canadian leaders looking to compete internationally for the best talent against that backdrop?
Well, the world is an incredibly smaller place than it was 10 years or 20 years ago. And I think in Canada in particular, as I've worked around the world, what I have noticed is we are born from a historically hierarchical system in terms of how corporations typically work, because we're a smaller place relative to other developed nations. And frankly, we have fewer large companies. And so that system of hierarchy, or how you get promoted, or how you move up in organizations, or how you find new opportunities is still steeped in historical construct of where did you go to school? How long have you been in the role? How well you comply within existing corporate dynamics and organizational structures. And I think the world largely has moved on from that. I think today's best leaders are dynamic, but empathetic, creative, but analytical, curious, but well-informed. So to be able to thrive in an organization today, you have to have a certain amount of agility, but also an ability to thrive in ambiguity. And I think what I would say is, from a hiring talent perspective, it's very easy to hire for what you think you need today. It's a lot harder to hire for what you think you might want for the ambition you want to achieve. And so putting yourself into that future lens of where do I want to be in 3 years or 5 years? And will this individual help me get there? I think is probably, for me, the most important thing in terms of talent development and hiring.
It's great advice, great observations, and very consistent with what we're seeing and advising our clients on globally. Avik, as one of relatively few diverse CEOs in the industrial landscape in Canada, what can we learn from your journey that we should try to replicate? And how does DEI factor into your strategic priorities for Capital Power?
This has been a real journey for me, Sean, personally. Part of my own history is having grown up in Alberta and then moving away and working in different countries and different places. if you and I were having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said, I leave my identity at the door. It's about performance, it's about getting the job done, and who I am as a person is outside of who I am in the office. And I really tried to live that. I don't think that was right. I didn't know that 10 or 15 years ago. And I had a colleague of mine who really brought that to light for me about 5 or 7 years ago as I was actually coming up to speed on DEI in the workplace. And to be authentic, to create followership, to be able to try and push a movement, today more than at any other point in time in the last 50 years, you can only achieve that through authenticity. So me being able to share and own my own upbringing, my own cultural background is what actually creates a safe environment to work in. It's what creates followership. And so for me, over the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, that's been a journey of sharing who I am, where I came from, what's important to me, because I didn't necessarily follow that throughout my career. So for me, that has been a significant learning. I don't know that that's something to replicate. I actually know that it's not, but it's part of a very deliberate shift I've had to make. But it's been also a liberating shift that I've had to make, being able to celebrate that. I'm very fortunate at Capital Power. DEI has been a foundational tenet to our organization for a very long time. It's part of the fabric of our organization in terms of how we develop talent, how we engage with stakeholders. I think there's much more to do on that front, on the stakeholder front. So we're looking to continuously improve. But I think it is a big factor in how we think about partnering, how do we think about being good partners in our communities, and how we develop and grow our organization.
We've mentioned a couple times that you've worked and invested globally. So let me ask you this. What aspects of Canadian business culture do you think are the most distinctive that more companies would benefit from adopting? And conversely, what aspects of other countries' corporate cultures and practices could Canadian companies benefit from?
Well, if you look at some of the most successful companies we've had that are born in this country, I think there's a common thread between them, which is we've thrived in this space between risk-taking and conservatism in a good way. We've thrived in this space between being entrepreneurial, but being in a space of disciplined growth. And I think it's cultural for us, but partly it's just the foundational network that we have in a country of less than 40 million people and the ecosystem that supports great ideas and great people. So if you look at the industries in which we lead, whether it's pensions or formation of AI, energy, banking, they all have those similar themes of we can invest, test, and incubate technology, but we deliver the goods in terms of reliability, safety, efficiency. In the banking world, that conveys over in how we manage our balance sheet and how we manage the risk. In the pension world, it translates in how we take risks and manage capital on behalf of beneficiaries, but still be cutting edge in terms of investment management expertise. And for us, I think for the large part, that's been our special sauce. It's how do you play in evolving industries? Now, unfortunately, that also creates a ceiling and a floor. To be able to play, you have to meet a certain level of scale or have enough fortitude or market acceptance to be able to gain entry to the arena to play. And scale, it's a limit because we don't necessarily focus on benefiting the outliers, or we don't focus on amplifying the outliers because we're more focused on preserving the ecosystem. So for me, I think that's what's always been special. I think what's also very unique about the Canadian capital markets is we have a long history of incubating and encouraging and building small to mid-sized enterprises that doesn't exist in other places around the world. And I think the most specific example of that is what we've done on venture exchanges or the Toronto stock market. What the Canadian capital markets have done in the mining space, in the energy space over the last 30 or 40 years, in encouraging companies from around the world to come to this market to list, to attract investors from around the world, and the ecosystem to build these companies is unparalleled. Now, as those industries are going through transition and maturing, I think we have an incredible opportunity to apply that to the net zero future and do the same thing for those industries. But we also have to have the ecosystem that supports those industries.
That's so well said. For my part, I would love to see Canadian companies telling their story more on the global stage, and more CEOs like yourself with international experience, comfort in and understanding of the capital markets could really help Canadian companies continue to grow and thrive on a global scale. Avik, I always enjoy our conversations. This one was no different. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for having me.